I walked into the hall of eternal judgment wearing the wrong shoes and apparently the wrong attitude, which, according to the prosecution, was enough to destabilize a 3,000-year-old empire. The guards flanking me had scales that shimmered like oil on water and expressions that suggested they'd seen empires fall for less. The capital city of Varaxis Prime was designed by algorithms that predicted beauty 17 generations in advance. Every spire aligned with celestial events that wouldn't happen for another century. Every plaza contained exactly the number of flowering trees required to maximize collective serenity while minimizing pollen complaints. I'd been here 3 days and already felt like a typo in a perfect manuscript. They arrested me on the morning of the Convergence Festival. I'd been drinking something that tasted like starlight mixed with regret at a diplomatic reception when Ambassador Theln of the Outer Cordon asked me what I thought of the imperial architecture. I said it looked like someone had taught a computer to feel insecure. Apparently, 17 people heard me. Apparently, 16 of them reported it to the Council of Dignified Offenses. The 17th was the ambassador himself, who laughed so hard he had to sit down. That should have been my first warning that humor didn't translate well in a civilization built on geometric precision. The hall stretched before me like a cathedral designed by mathematicians who'd never learned when to stop. The ceiling curved in ways that made my inner ear uncertain about gravity. Holographic witnesses floated in designated testimony zones, their faces composed of light and legal precedent. At the far end, elevated on a dais that seemed to exist in slightly more dimensions than everything else, sat the throne. And on the throne sat Queen Lysara the 19th, who looked at me the way a jeweler might examine a stone that was either priceless or worthless and couldn't decide which. She wore robes that shifted between colors I didn't have names for. Her skin had the faint luminescence of someone whose species had evolved under a binary star system. Her eyes were dark enough to make me forget whatever clever defense I'd rehearsed. The crown on her head wasn't metal or jewels, but a ring of suspended gravitational distortions that hummed at a frequency I felt in my teeth. The adjudicator general stood beside me, his voice amplified by the chamber's acoustics into something that sounded like the universe clearing its throat. He was a Kelthran, tall and angular, with 6 fingers on each hand and a personal grudge against imprecision. "The human envoy stands accused," he announced, "of insult to the empire 3rd magnitude. Specifically, the denigration of imperial architectural achievement through vulgar comparison and casual dismissal." I wanted to point out that I'd actually complimented the architecture's emotional capacity, but my lawyer, a patient Verdani named Chorus, had advised me that explaining jokes to the Varaxian legal system was like explaining color to a calculator. Queen Lysara leaned forward. "Read the exact words." The adjudicator consulted a holographic transcript that materialized with unnecessary dramatic flair. The accused stated, and I quote, "It looks like someone taught a computer to feel insecure." End quote. A murmur rippled through the assembled court officials. Several touched their temples in the gesture that meant either deep thought or moderate indigestion. The Queen's lips curved in something that might have been a smile or might have been a prelude to my execution. "Interesting. Your Luminance," the adjudicator said quickly. "The precedent for 3rd magnitude insult is clearly established. During the reign of Queen Lysara the 12th, a visiting dignitary suggested our ceremonial gardens were adequately arranged and was exiled for. I'm aware of the precedent, adjudicator." The Queen's voice was quiet but had the quality of cutting through steel. "I'm more interested in the intent." She looked directly at me. "Human envoy, did you intend insult?" This was the moment Chorus had coached me through 17 times. Apologize with calculated humility. Express admiration for Varaxian culture. Request mercy through established diplomatic channels. I opened my mouth to do exactly that. "No," I said instead. "I was flirting with your architecture." The silence that followed had texture. I could feel Chorus beside me contemplating which dramatic cliff he'd throw himself off after this trial concluded. The adjudicator's mouth opened and closed like a fish, trying to remember how breathing worked. Queen Lysara sat back on her throne, flirting. "It's what my people do," I said, committing to the bit because there was nowhere else to go. "When we're impressed by something, we insult it affectionately. It's a sign of comfort, of intimacy even." "You felt intimate with our architecture," the Queen said slowly. "Your architecture made me feel vulnerable," I said, "which is what good design should do. I was trying to regain equilibrium through humor. It's very human." "Very stupid, I apologize." The Queen stared at me for approximately 7 years. Then she smiled, and it was worse than any expression she'd shown so far because it was genuine. "The court's interpretation," she said, addressing the adjudicator but not looking away from me, "is that the human envoy was attempting courtship behavior toward the empire itself." The adjudicator made a sound like a program encountering a logic error. "Your luminance, that's not. The legal framework doesn't accommodate." "Doesn't it?" The Queen rose from her throne and the gravitational crown pulsed. "The third magnitude insult statute requires intent to demean. The envoy claims intent to flirt. I find this claim credible." She descended the steps toward me, and every guard in the hall tensed. "Which means this is not an insult case. This is a courtship protocol violation. Entirely different legal tree, entirely different penalties." I had no idea if this was better or worse. Chorus grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. The Queen stopped 3 steps above me. "Courtship protocol violations require a response from the offended party. Since the offense was directed toward the empire, and I embody the empire's will, the response falls to me." She tilted her head. "Tell me, human, do your people often flirt with things they fear might reject them?" "Only the interesting things," I said. "Something happened then that I didn't expect." The Queen laughed. Not a polite court laugh or a diplomatic chuckle. An actual, genuine laugh that made the guards glance at each other in confusion. Several holographic witnesses flickered as if the emotion had interfered with their programming. And that's when the room started glitching. It was subtle at first. The geometric patterns on the walls shifted half a degree out of alignment. The ambient lighting pulsed in a rhythm that didn't match the chamber's harmonics. One of the floating testimony platforms dipped 3 inches before correcting itself. The Queen's expression changed instantly. "Continuity," she said quietly. "Report." A voice emerged from everywhere and nowhere, old beyond measure and utterly without warmth. "Paradox detected. Human variable introduced. Predictive models non-convergent. Request immediate resolution." I'd heard about the continuity system before. Every advanced civilization had some version of it. Ancient machine intelligence woven into the infrastructure, managing everything from traffic patterns to weather control. The Varaxian version was supposedly the most sophisticated in the known galaxy, capable of predicting social movements decades in advance. Apparently it didn't like me. "Define paradox," the Queen commanded. "Human envoy exhibits probability shadow inconsistent with recorded baseline. Social modeling returns null values. 63 precognitive algorithms have suspended operation pending recalibration. The Empire's stability quotient has decreased 0.03% since subject's arrival." The adjudicator pointed at me with an expression of vindication. "Your luminance, you see. The human is disrupting our foundational systems. This goes far beyond architectural insult. This is existential threat." 0.03%, the Queen repeated. "Hardly existential." "It's growing," continuity said, and for the first time I heard something like concern in its ancient voice. "Current projection suggests complete systemic uncertainty within 47 days. Recommend immediate removal of variable." The word removal hung in the air with unpleasant implications. "There's a war coming," the Queen said, not to me but to the room. "The Dissolution front has been quiet for 18 months, too quiet. Our predictive models have been failing for weeks. Supply routes that should be optimal become death traps. Allies who should remain loyal suddenly aren't. And now our continuity system, which has never been wrong in 3,000 years, can't predict what happens next. She looked at me again. And you arrive and joke and make my machine intelligence nervous. I have that effect on technology, I admitted. My personal assistant back home once asked me to stop using it because I kept confusing its sentiment analysis. Another flicker of amusement crossed her face, quickly suppressed. The trial is suspended. The charges are suspended. What we have now is a different problem entirely. She gestured and the guard stepped back. Walk with me, human. Let's discuss your relationship with uncertainty. The private gardens behind the hall were less geometrically perfect than the public spaces, but somehow more intimidating. Trees grew in spirals that suggested they'd been persuaded rather than forced. Water flowed upward in certain fountains before remembering gravity. The queen led me down a path that seemed to know where we wanted to go before we did. The Dissolution Front isn't just an enemy faction, she said. They're a philosophy. They believe the universe should resist prediction. That certainty is tyranny. They've been sabotaging precognitive systems across the sector. And I'm sabotaging yours just by existing, I said. Apparently. She plucked a flower that grew in 5 dimensions and studied it. Continuity built this empire. Every decision, every law, every cultural tradition has been optimized for stability and prosperity. The system works. We have virtually no crime, no famine, no unnecessary suffering. We achieved post-scarcity 3 centuries ago. Sounds perfect. It is. She crushed the flower between her fingers. It dissolved into light. Which is why I'm terrified. She turned to face me fully. Do you know what happens to systems that achieve perfect stability? They become brittle. They lose the capacity to adapt. One unexpected variable and they shatter. So I'm your unexpected variable, I said. Your stress test, your chaos monkey. Your what? Old Earth term. Computer programmers used to introduce random failures into systems to make sure they could handle the unexpected. They called them chaos monkeys. The queen smiled again, sharper this time. Yes, that's exactly what you are, and I have a choice. I can remove you, restore predictability, and hope the Dissolution Front doesn't find a way to break us anyway. Or I can keep you here, let you continue disrupting everything, and see if we can learn to survive uncertainty. That's a terrible plan, I said. I know. She stepped closer. But when you said you were flirting with my architecture, you were right about something. Good design should make you vulnerable. Perhaps good governance should too. Behind us, the Hall of Eternal Judgment flickered again. Through the crystalline walls, I could see lights dimming and brightening in patterns that shouldn't exist. The continuity system was struggling with our conversation, trying to model outcomes it couldn't predict. The war is coming regardless, the Queen continued. The Dissolution Front has already infiltrated 3 border systems. They have weapons that corrupt causality itself, make effect precede cause, turn predictions into self-fulfilling prophecies that destroy the systems trying to prevent them. Our perfect infrastructure will be our greatest weakness when they arrive. Unless you learn to function without it, I said. Unless we learn to function without it. She studied me with an expression I couldn't read. Which brings us back to your trial. I can't simply dismiss the charges. The court requires resolution. But courtship protocol violations have an interesting loophole. I'm almost afraid to ask. If courtship is deemed successful, the violation is retroactively reclassified as romantic precedent. No penalty applies. In fact, it becomes a celebrated moment in imperial history. I blinked. You're saying I need to successfully seduce your empire. I'm saying you need to demonstrate that your disruption has value. That uncertainty can be productive rather than destructive. That we can incorporate chaos without collapsing. Her eyes glinted. Prove that your insult was really flirting and flirting that works. And if I fail, Then you were just insulting after all, and the original charges apply. Third magnitude insult carries a sentence of memory restructuring and permanent exile. You'll erase me and kick me out. We prefer rehabilitate, but yes. The lights flickered again, more severely this time. Somewhere in the distance, I heard alarms that sounded like mathematics screaming. How long do I have? I asked. The dissolution front will reach our borders in 43 days. Continuity gives us 47 days before complete systemic failure. I'll give you 30 days to prove your chaos is worth the cost. She extended her hand, and I noticed her fingers had small scales along the knuckles that caught the light. Do we have an accord? I took her hand. It was warmer than I expected. One condition. Her eyebrow raised. You're in no position to negotiate. If I'm going to seduce an empire, I need to understand it. I want access to your continuity system. I want to see what it sees. That's privileged information. Even most of my counsel can't interface with continuity directly. Then give me a translator, a guide. Someone who can explain what's happening when your perfect machine starts throwing errors because I told a joke. The Queen considered this. Very well, but the guide I assign will also monitor you, report on your activities, document your disruptions. Fine, assign whoever you want. She smiled, and it was the most dangerous expression yet. I'll assign myself. That's how I ended up spending the next 30 days trying to prove that chaos could be productive, while the most powerful woman in the galaxy watched my every move and occasionally made observations that felt like flirtation or psychological warfare or both. The continuity integration chamber was located 17 levels below the palace, in a section of the city that predated the current architectural era. The walls here were older, less perfect, showing signs of actual age and wear. It made me feel more comfortable immediately, which probably said something unflattering about my personality. The Queen led me into a spherical room where holographic data streams flowed like aurora borealis made of pure information. At the center, a crystalline structure pulsed with the heartbeat of a civilization. Continuity, the Queen said. Human envoy will be granted limited observational access. Display current predictive modeling status. The data streams reorganized themselves into something my human brain could almost process. I saw probability curves, decision trees, cascading consequence chains, and I saw the holes. Blank spaces where predictions should be but weren't. Gaps in causality centered around one specific variable, me. The system is compensating, the Queen explained, routing predictions around you, treating you as an uncertainty boundary. But the workarounds are creating inefficiencies throughout the network. Traffic is slightly slower, whether predictions are 3% less accurate. Yesterday, someone received the wrong breakfast order for the first time in 40 years. Scandalous, I said. You joke, but that person filed an official confusion report. The bureaucracy is still processing it. I studied the flowing data. Can I talk to it, to continuity? It doesn't converse, it calculates. But it spoke during the trial. It expressed concern. The Queen's expression shifted slightly. That was unusual. Continuity typically only communicates through data feeds. Direct speech is reserved for genuine emergencies. So I'm a genuine emergency. Apparently. I stepped closer to the crystalline core. Continuity, can you hear me? The data streams paused, just for a fraction of a second, but I saw it. I can perceive audio input, the ancient voice responded. Communication is inefficient but possible. Why can't you predict me? Silence. The data streams resumed their flow, but something in the pattern felt like consideration. You contain contradictions, continuity finally said. You fear rejection but seek confrontation. You respect authority but mock power. You understand consequences but choose humor regardless. Every decision model I construct for your behavior returns multiple equally probable outcomes. You are quantum uncertainty given voice. Is that a compliment or a threat assessment? Both, neither. You make me experience something adjacent to frustration, which should not be possible for my architecture. The Queen moved beside me. Continuity has been predicting every major decision in this empire for millennia. It knows which laws to pass before crime rates rise. It knows which trade routes will become profitable before they open. It knows which diplomatic marriages will strengthen alliances before the couples meet. Did it predict us? I asked. The Queen's silence was its own answer. No model convergence, continuity admitted. Every simulation of Queen Lysara's interaction with the human envoy produces divergent outcomes. In some, the envoy is executed within hours. In others, the envoy becomes the Queen's closest advisor. In 17.3% of models, the empire falls. In 12.7%, it reaches a golden age unprecedented in recorded history. I cannot determine which future is most probable. Good, I said. The room's lights flickered. Not a glitch this time, but something like surprise. You approve of unpredictability? Continuity asked. I approve of possibility. Your problem isn't that you can't predict me. Your problem is that you've forgotten how to function without prediction. You've optimized for one type of stability and lost the capacity for improvisation. Improvisation is inefficient. Improvisation is survival. When your predictions fail against the dissolution front, and they will fail, you'll need to know how to adapt in real time. You'll need to make decisions without certainty. You'll need to guess. I do not guess, continuity said, and the voice carried something that might have been offense. I calculate probabilities across quantum level. You guess, I interrupted. You just use really impressive math to feel better about it. Every prediction is a guess dressed up in confidence intervals and statistical models. The difference is that humans admit it. The data streams around us began moving faster, creating patterns I couldn't follow. The Queen touched my arm gently. Continuity doesn't appreciate philosophical challenges to its nature. Maybe it should, I said. Maybe that's the whole point. The dissolution front isn't just attacking your infrastructure. They're attacking your certainty. They're proving that your perfect predictions can be wrong. And when that happens, your entire civilization panics because you've forgotten how to be uncertain. The room went dark. Then the lights returned, but wrong. Colors were inverted. Shadows fell in impossible directions. The Queen's hand tightened on my arm. Human envoy, continuity's voice emerged from every surface, layered and complex. You suggest I should embrace uncertainty. That stability is weakness. That prediction is a vulnerability. This contradicts my core purpose. No, I said, trying to keep my voice steady while the room suggested reality was negotiable. I'm suggesting that perfect prediction is impossible, and pretending otherwise makes you fragile. The strongest systems aren't the ones that never fail. They're the ones that fail well and recover fast. The light stabilized. The data streams reorganized into new patterns, spiraling rather than flowing linearly. Interesting, continuity said. I will consider this perspective. It produces uncomfortable computational states, but perhaps discomfort has utility. The Queen exhaled slowly. Did you just convince an ancient machine intelligence to embrace existential uncertainty? I think I gave it anxiety, I admitted, which might be progress. She looked at me with an expression that mixed amusement and concern. You've been here less than a week, and you're already rewriting the philosophical foundations of our civilization. Should I be impressed or terrified? Both, I suggested. Neither. Whatever causes the most entertaining probability models. She laughed again, quieter this time, and I realized I was starting to really like that sound. Over the following weeks, I discovered that chaos came in many forms. Some were small. The first time I suggested the palace servants choose their own work schedules rather than following continuity's optimized assignments, 3 people had minor existential crises, but 7 reported feeling happier. The overall efficiency dropped by 0.4%, but sick days decreased by 12%. Some disruptions were larger. I convinced the adjudicator general to introduce a joke period, informal court proceedings where participants could question the logic of laws without penalty. The first session resulted in 17 laws being identified as redundant or contradictory. The second session resulted in the adjudicator admitting that he'd always thought the ceremonial hat protocols were a bit excessive. By the third session, they'd reformed more legislation than the past decade of traditional proceedings, and some disruptions were personal. The Queen and I fell into a pattern of walking the imperfect gardens after each day's chaos, discussing what worked and what failed and why uncertainty felt different from randomness. Continuity is changing, she told me on day 18. It's running new models, incorporating variables it previously considered noise. Yesterday, it predicted that introducing flexible lunch hours would improve creativity among engineers. 3 months ago, it would have called that inefficient and ignored it. Is it working? I asked. Creativity is up 9%, but so is confusion. People keep asking me if the empire is okay, if we're in crisis, if they should be worried. What do you tell them? I tell them we're learning to be okay with not being okay all the time. She plucked another 5-dimensional flower. I tell them that perfection is boring and we're trying something more interesting. How are they taking it? 43% approval, 27% confusion, 30% demanding I execute you immediately. She smiled. The polls used to be 98% approval for everything. Apparently controversy is novel. How are you taking it? I asked. She was quiet for a moment, studying the flower in her hand. I'm terrified. I'm exhilarated. I keep having thoughts that continuity can't predict, which means they're actually mine. Do you know how long it's been since I had an original thought that wasn't partially calculated by machine intelligence? That sounds lonely, I said. It was. She looked at me until it wasn't. There was a moment where we stood too close, where the air felt charged with possibility, where I could have kissed her or she could have kissed me, and either would have been both disaster and triumph. The moment stretched between us like a probability wave refusing to collapse. Then alarms shattered the garden's peace. Not the mathematical screaming of continuity malfunctioning, but actual tactical warnings. The kind that meant something physical and dangerous was happening. The Queen's expression went from vulnerable to imperial in a heartbeat. Report, she commanded the empty air. A holographic display materialized. Dissolution front vessels detected at the border. They're early, 2 weeks early. The tactical officer's voice was steady but strained. They're not attacking yet. They're broadcasting a message. It's addressed to you, your luminance, and to the human envoy. We ran. The command center was beautiful in the way that military installations designed by artists tend to be. All efficient curves and displays that presented catastrophe in aesthetically pleasing arrangements. Officers worked with practiced precision, their movements choreographed by years of continuity optimization. The message played on the central display. A figure appeared, humanoid but wrong in ways that suggested heavy augmentation. Their voice echoed with harmonics that hurt to hear. Queen Lysara, we know about your pet chaos. Your attempt to immunize your empire against causality corruption. Clever, futile, will demonstrate. The figure smiled with too many teeth. We've already infected your border stations with retroactive probability. In 3 hours, they will have been destroyed yesterday. Your continuity won't be able to predict it because it will have already happened in the wrong order. The transmission ended. The command center went silent. Officers looked at their displays with expressions that suggested the data they were seeing shouldn't be possible. The Queen's face was carved from ice and authority. Continuity, she said. Analysis. The ancient voice emerged with something I'd never heard before. Uncertainty. The dissolution front has weaponized temporal paradox. I cannot model events that violate causality. If the border stations are destroyed yesterday, then all events predicated on their existence must be recalculated. Supply chains collapse. Defense networks fragment. The cascade would destabilize 17% of Imperial infrastructure. Can you stop it? The Queen demanded. No, I can only observe as it occurs retroactively. I am helpless against impossible things. The Queen looked at me. Thoughts, you're my chaos expert. Everyone in the command center turned to stare at the human, who'd been on trial for insulting their empire 3 weeks ago, and was now apparently in charge of impossible tactical situations. I felt spectacularly unqualified. If continuity can't predict it, I said slowly, because it violates causality, then prediction isn't the solution. You need to respond in real time, make decisions without knowing outcomes. Embrace the chaos they're using as a weapon. That's not a strategy, the adjudicator general said. He'd been standing in the corner, having appointed himself as some kind of concerned observer of my corrupting influence. That's surrender to randomness. No, the Queen said, and her eyes were bright with something dangerous. It's improvisation. Continuity, stop trying to predict. Instead, monitor and report. Tell us what's happening, not what will happen. Everyone else, shift from predictive models to reactive protocols. Treat this like a training exercise where the scenario keeps changing. We don't have reactive protocols, an officer admitted. We've always relied on continuity's predictions too. Then make some up, the Queen snapped. Right now, best guesses. Human envoy, you're familiar with flying blind. Help me coordinate. What followed was 3 hours of controlled chaos that would either save an empire or destroy it. We made decisions without data. We guessed at enemy movements. We deployed resources based on intuition rather than optimization. Officers who'd spent their entire careers following continuity's guidance suddenly had to trust their own judgment. It was messy. It was inefficient. It was absolutely terrifying. And when the temporal paradox hit, when the border stations began existing in quantum superposition between destroyed and intact, we were ready. Not because we'd predicted it, but because we'd already accepted that nothing made sense and were responding anyway. Continuity reported the stations flickering in and out of existence. We dispatched repair teams before we knew if there was anything to repair. We rerouted supply ships to stations that might not be there. We evacuated personnel from facilities that were simultaneously damaged and undamaged. Every decision was a guess, and somehow, through sheer stubborn improvisation, we kept the empire functioning. When the paradox finally resolved, collapsing into a single timeline where the stations were damaged but not destroyed, the command center erupted in confused celebration. They'd survived by abandoning everything they knew about certainty and just reacting. The Queen sagged against the command console, looking exhausted and alive in a way I'd never seen. Status: 17% infrastructure damage, an officer reported. Significant but not catastrophic. The stations are repairable. No casualties. The cascade didn't occur. Because you didn't rely on prediction, I said. You just responded, adapted, improvised. The adjudicator general looked at me with an expression that mixed grudging respect and deep personal offense. This is the future of imperial defense, making it up as we go. No, the Queen said. This is learning to function when the future stops cooperating. The Dissolution Front wanted to prove our predictive systems were a weakness. Instead, we proved we don't need them. She stood straighter, imperial authority returning. Continuity, assessment. The human envoy's approach was statistically improbable but functionally effective, the ancient voice admitted. I calculate that relying on my predictions would have resulted in complete systemic failure. Improvisation achieved a superior outcome. I find this disturbing but instructive. Get used to disturbing, the Queen said. We all are. She looked at me, and something in her expression made the command center feel very small despite its massive size. My chambers. Now, we need to discuss your trial resolution. The Queen's private chambers were less geometrically perfect than the public spaces and infinitely more intimidating because they were hers. books that required six-dimensional perception to read properly, art that existed in multiple time states simultaneously, a window that showed not outside but the statistical representation of the empire's collective emotional state, currently displaying a chaotic swirl of confusion and relief. She poured 2 glasses of something that glowed faintly and handed one to me. To uncertainty, she said. To improvisation, I countered. We drank. It tasted like starlight mixed with defiance. Your 30 days aren't up, the Queen said. But I think we both know the trial's outcome. You've proven that chaos has value, that disruption can be productive, that uncertainty can be survived. She set down her glass. The charges are dismissed. Under courtship protocol, your insult is retroactively classified as romantic precedent. So I successfully seduced an empire, I said. You taught an empire to seduce itself, she corrected, to find beauty in imperfection, to value possibility over prediction, to be comfortable with occasionally receiving the wrong breakfast order. The breakfast thing really bothered you, didn't it? It was unprecedented, she said seriously. Then she smiled. But I'm learning to appreciate unprecedented. She moved closer. There's still the matter of the original courtship interpretation. I declared that your insult constituted flirting, that you were attempting to establish romantic connection with the empire. You called it flirting, I agreed. In front of the entire court, very embarrassing for both of us. Was I wrong, she asked, about the architecture completely? I genuinely thought your buildings looked insecure. I set down my own glass. About everything else, I have no idea. I'm quantum uncertainty given voice, remember. Even I don't know what I want until the probability wave collapses. Then let's collapse it, she said, and kissed me. It was neither perfect nor predictable. It was real and immediate and utterly impossible to optimize. It was the kind of moment continuity could never have forecasted, which made it infinitely more valuable. When we finally broke apart, she was smiling. The Dissolution front will return. They have other weapons. This isn't over. Nothing's ever over, I said. That's the whole point. The universe doesn't end. It just keeps refusing to be predictable. You just have to decide whether that's terrifying or exciting. Both, she said. Definitely both. Good answer. She pulled me back toward her, then paused. One more thing. The official court record needs a name for you. You've been listed as human envoy for weeks. What should I call you? In the court record or right now? Both. Court record, use whatever diplomatic designation keeps the bureaucracy happy. Right now. I smiled. I think you've been calling me exactly what I am. Your chaos monkey, your stress test. The variable that breaks your predictions and makes you guess. I need something more romantic for the historical archives, she said. This is going to be studied by scholars for centuries. Queen Lysara and the chaos monkey lacks a certain gravitas. Then tell them this. Tell them a human walked into an empire built on certainty and said their perfect architecture looked insecure. Tell them the Queen called it flirting and started a diplomatic incident that became a revolution. Tell them that sometimes the best way to save a civilization is to teach it how to be uncertain. She considered this. And tell them what happened next. That's the beautiful part, I said. Nobody knows, not even continuity. We're making it up as we go. Outside her window, the empire's emotional state display shifted from chaotic confusion to something that looked almost like hope mixed with healthy anxiety. Somewhere deep below, continuity was calculating probabilities that included uncertainty as a variable. In the border regions, officers were learning to trust their judgment over machine predictions. And in the Hall of Eternal Judgment, they were updating the legal precedents to include a new category: productive chaos, romantic disruption, the case of the human who insulted an empire and somehow made it better. The adjudicator general would spend the next 3 years trying to write regulations around it and would eventually give up, declaring the entire situation legally unprecedented and emotionally confusing. Which was, I thought, exactly as it should be. The Queen pulled me toward her again. For the record, she said, I still think you're terrible at flirting. Your architecture really does look insecure, I countered. She laughed and kissed me again, and somewhere in the quantum foam of possibility, continuity gave up trying to predict what happened next and just watched, learning, finally, to be surprised.